History as it happens, November 3rd, 2022. Getting Wilson wrong.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Opportunity knocks again. There is no guarantee that opportunity will knock a third time.
We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas.
We will only succeed in this interconnected world by continuing to lead the fight for free people and free and fair trade. A free and prosperous global economy is essential for America's prosperity.
The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands.
A century after Woodrow Wilson declared the world must be made safe for democracy, an American president speaks of a global struggle between democracy and autocracy, with a front line in Ukraine, where U.S. arms and expertise are helping Ukrainians fend off a Russian invasion. Talk of the fate of democracy at home and abroad is constant these days, as generations of Americans have taken it for granted that their country must defend democracy anywhere it's imperiled. Maybe we got Woodrow Wilson wrong. That's next with David M. Kennedy, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
But their fight is part of a larger fight that unites all people. There's a fight that so many of the patriots whose eternal rest is here in these hallowed grounds were part of. The battle between democracy and autocracy.
On April 2, 1917, about 3 years after the European War began, with millions already dead in what historian John Keegan, writing decades later, described as an unnecessary, existentially pointless conflict, President Woodrow Wilson sought a declaration of war from a joint session of Congress. After narrowly winning re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," Wilson now explained why the U.S. could no longer avoid the Great War. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he said. "Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them." Well, if we Americans today take it for granted that democracy has to be defended, that all people want to live in a democracy, and that it is up to the United States to lead the way, those ideas were not universally embraced when Wilson spoke more than 105 years ago. But Wilson did want to create a new international order based around his League of Nations, a dream crushed by the resurgence of isolationism after 1918, but a dream that would be realized a generation later as the United States emerged victorious from the Second World War, with the establishment of the IMF, World Bank, United Nations, NATO, and more. In a speech to the Foreign Policy Association in 1944, FDR warned against making the same mistake the U.S. had made in 1919. That is, it could not withdraw from world affairs again, not if peace and democracy were to thrive.
I believe now that enduring peace in the world has not a chance unless this nation, our America, is willing to cooperate in winning it and maintaining it. I thought back in those days of 1918 and 1919, and I know now that we have to back our American words with American deeds.
Well, every American president since then, with the exception of Donald Trump, has echoed Woodrow Wilson to one degree or another, as the victors of 1945 became the victors of the Cold War, and democracy appeared to be on the march and unstoppable. Throughout the past 75 years, it's been a staple of American foreign policy to promote or encourage or defend democracy. Democracy and capitalism, of course. It's the basis for President Biden's policy in Ukraine.
Freedom has never been free. Democracy has always required champions. Today, in the perennial struggle for democracy and freedom, Ukraine and its people are on the front lines fighting to save their nation. But their fight is part of a larger fight that unites all people. There's a fight that so many of the patriots whose eternal rest is here in these hallowed grounds were part of. A battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between appetites and ambition of a few who forever seek to dominate the lives and liberties of many.
Now, let's set aside, if we can, the fact that during the Cold War, the U.S. backed many vicious authoritarian states, even overthrew democratically elected leaders in CIA covert operations, and to this day still supports states like Saudi Arabia, hardly a democracy. Let's set all of that aside if we can. Would Wilson approve of what Biden just said there? Well, by arming and supporting Ukraine, the U.S. is, you might say, making it safe for democracy as Russia tries to turn it into a client state. Public intellectuals such as Anne Applebaum, Timothy Snyder, and Francis Fukuyama have echoed the president's remarks, describing Ukraine as a front line in a global struggle against dictators who must not be appeased. Well, you might say it's a form of Wilsonian activist foreign policy. Our guest today, writing in his book, Over Here, The First World War in American Society, said it could also be described as having saddled the United States ever after with some unusually weighty, easily misunderstood, and sometimes dangerously inappropriate international commitments. So how often do you think about how we got to this point, or why the U.S. got involved in so many foreign misadventures in the name of freedom and democracy, if we're to believe the rhetoric in all those presidential speeches?
The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world.
Well, maybe this whole time we've gotten Wilson wrong. David M. Kennedy is one of my favorite historians. He is professor emeritus at Stanford University, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, which is part of the Oxford History of the United States series. David Kennedy, welcome back.
Happy to be with you.
So as I was preparing to speak to you, I consulted your earlier book, Over Here, The First World War in American Society. And I also read Wilson's April 2nd, 1917 speech to Congress, in which he explains the U.S. casus belli, framing the war in Europe as an existential one for certain principles rather than a war over simple state interest. And here is part of the key paragraph. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty, etc., etc. So what did Wilson mean?
Well, I think he meant something quite different from the popular misunderstanding of that phrase, that the world must be safe for democracy. And I may be being over scrupulous about this, but let's take what he said absolutely literally. He did not say we must make the world democratic. He was not on a mission to transform all the regimes of the world. He wanted the world to be reshaped in a way that would make those regimes that had managed to establish themselves on democratic principles free to pursue those principles and not turn into heavily armed states that were in a constant state of preparation for or actual engagement in warfare. Particularly in recent years, I think a lot of people have misunderstood that phrase as somehow declaring a mission on the part of the United States to transform the entire world into democratic states. And I don't think that is what Wilson meant. He was too good an historian to believe that that was even an achievable goal, even with all the material resources and other resources that the United States could bring to bear.
Well, that seems to be the mission the United States has taken up over the decades, however.
To be sure, that Wilson's definition of the mission has been, I think, not only misunderstood, but distorted. But the real achievement of the kind of program that he was reaching for really comes into being at the end of the Second World War, 1944, 1945, when the Roosevelt administration puts in place a number of transnational institutions like the United Nations, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, better known as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and later things like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which morphs into the World Trade Organization later in the century. Those are the kinds of institutions that Wilson envisioned when he proposed to the League of Nations in the earlier part of the century. And they were institutions that their intention was to bring into the international order at least a measure of the kind of structured forums for the resolution of disputes that were typical of well-organized domestic societies. It was an ambitious, but not at all unrealistic or utopian aspiration. And indeed, we saw a lot of it implemented in the second half of the century.
Let's talk about how Wilson's ideas were somewhat novel at the time. I wasn't able to listen to the speech. There's no audio of it, so I did read it. He does frame the war in Europe as something that should matter to everyone because there are these principles at stake. He basically says the world won't be safe if we have autocracies like Germany upsetting the apple cart. Some context here. There was a big debate in this country, late 19th, early 20th centuries, about whether the U.S. should possess non-contiguous territory, Spanish-American War, and also the notion that the U.S. should be involved militarily or otherwise in the affairs of other parts of the world. William Jennings Bryan, right? He was Wilson's Secretary of State. He quits because of, I guess it was the First World War, right? He quits over that. So there's
he quit over what he thought was a too belligerent response to the sinking of the Lusitania.
So this idea that the United States needs to be protecting democracies on the other side of the world, that was new, wasn't it?
Well, yes and no. The United States had been a scrupulous neutral since the founding of the American Republic in the late 18th century. Washington's famous neutrality proclamation, the warnings by both Washington and Jefferson not to get into entangling alliances and so on. So what do neutrals want? Neutrals want other countries to observe certain rules of international behavior, but they don't want to commit their resources to the enforcement of those rules. They want everybody to get on board in some kind of a concordat or a legal arrangement to honor the rules. It's the classic posture of small states that simply don't have the resources to shape the international environment and therefore want a rules-based order at a low cost. That had been the United States diplomatic position throughout the entire 19th century. By the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, it was becoming obvious to lots of people that the United States now commanded the kind of economic resources to play a much bigger role in the world. It had the world's largest railroad network. It was the largest producer of steel. It was about to become an international creditor on international credit markets. And it was clear that the United States now had the capacity, at least the latent capacity, to play a role in shaping the international environment to a degree that it had not had in the first century plus of its existence. So the Spanish-American War is a kind of trigger for an ongoing national debate in 1898 down to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 about what role the United States should play in the world order. And Wilson himself framed this question, I think, quite eloquently in a 4th of July address in Philadelphia at Independence Hall on July 4th, 1914. And he said something to the effect, I can't quote it exactly from memory, but he said something to the effect of, what role should this great nation play in the world? Will we simply play the old game of our own aggrandizement and so on and so forth? And he was suggesting, no, the United States has a different role to play. And he was injecting himself into this debate that had been going on for roughly 2 decades. Broadly speaking, I'm summarizing an awful lot of complicated, nuanced history here, but broadly speaking, there were 2 positions in that debate before Wilson took voice. One was the United States should stick to its ancient principles of isolationism and just not get involved in the international order at all. That was the position of people like, for example, William James, the Harvard philosopher and psychologist, and to a certain degree also William Jennings Bryan, whom you mentioned. The other position is most famously associated with Theodore Roosevelt, who was president from 1901 to 1909. Roosevelt clearly was, in the theory and practice of international relations, called a realist. He thought that the country should seek its interests with whatever means available. That's why he sends the Great White Fleet around the world in 1907 to demonstrate to everybody that this country now has the capacity to project power across the world ocean. And he wanted the United States to take its place at the table, as it were, speaking metaphorically, where the great game of international politics was played. A people that had, for generations, lived under the sheltering fact of 2 big oceans on each of its shores, and was committed still to the principles of isolationism, was not ready to hear Theodore Roosevelt's message. And I do believe that one of his great disappointments when he left office, down to the end of his life, was that the United States simply wasn't ready to take up the great power role that he envisioned for it.
He also wanted to be president during the First World War.
Yes, at some point he said, if I'd been president, I would have been at war with Germany by the end of 1914. Of course, we don't go to war till almost 3 years later. But I'm not alone in thinking that Roosevelt was a classical realist. He believed in that classic formula that we find in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars, the famous Melian dialogue, where the Melians complain that they have done nothing to provoke the Athenians, and why are they being invaded? And the Athenian general says, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. That is the classic maxim of all realist diplomacy. The American people weren't ready for that.
I want to ask, as Wilson is elevating the war in Europe to something the United States needs to get involved in because the world must be made safe for democracy, what are ordinary Americans who've been watching this horrible war from the other side of the Atlantic thinking when Wilson says this?
Well, that's an excellent question to which there is not a very crisp and clear answer. Roughly 1/3 of all people living in the United States of America in 1914-17 were either immigrants or had at least one parent who was an immigrant. And a lot of those people came from the so-called Axis powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary. Others came from the other side, from Russia and Great Britain and France. So there was a lot of, you might say, just ethnic division in the country at large. And if you read American newspapers from 1914, when the news breaks in this country that war has broken out in Europe, you'll find newspapers filled with commentary to the effect that, thank God Columbus discovered the New World, that we're not there. We're here. We're thousands of miles away. We don't have any dogs in this fight, and we're going to keep it that way. Now, against that background, it becomes somewhat amazing to me that there was another sector of American society, once the war breaks out, that goes kind of nuts in its patriotic effusions and its desire to get in on the action. And lots of young men volunteered for service. Even before the United States entered the war, they flew in the things like the Lafayette Escadrille in France. It's an anomaly that I've never quite fully understood, why there was this passion for war in some quarters in American society and the stubborn persistence of isolationist sentiment, or you might say isolationist indifference to the fate of Europe on the other. And of course, after the war ends, in the decade of the 1920s and 1930s, that isolationist sentiment reasserts itself. And the idea settles deeply into the American consciousness 2 decades after the war that our intervention in 1917 in the European war was a great mistake, great departure from established American diplomatic practice and principle.
And not really a fight for democracy. I mean, we're dealing with colonial powers fighting each other in Europe.
Well, yeah, and the idea was that we were going to intervene in the war so that we could have a voice in the peace settlement and rearrange the international order along Wilsonian lines. Instead, what do we get? We get fascism in Italy, we get Nazism in Germany, we get the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the world starts to rearm again in the 1930s, and eventually we get the Second War. And so the whole purpose of Wilsonian intervention seemed to be utterly futile and inconsequential, as people concluded in the 20s and 30s.
So as you say here in your book, Over Here, you say, if neither traditional isolationism nor conventional realpolitik would do, then it fell to Wilson to craft an authentically American foreign policy that would so resonate in the hearts of his countrymen as to provide a sustainable basis for American international engagement. But you also say it could be described as having saddled the U.S. ever after with some unusually weighty, easily misunderstood, and sometimes dangerously inappropriate international commitments. As we've been discussing here, there was a lot of skepticism about this idea, but 1945 and the end of the Second World War does a lot of work to get Americans on board with this idea, doesn't it? I mean, that does change everything.
Absolutely. I mean, if there is an inflection point in the character, structure, architecture of the international order, it is the conclusion of World War II, when you really begin to see the emergence of consequential organizations, international organizations, the ones I mentioned earlier, like the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and so on. And there are others. I mean, the International Atomic Energy Agency. I mean, there's a whole raft by now in the 21st century of these kinds of institutions. We can argue a lot about how effective they are. But from the point of view of the 19th century, let's say, or even the early 20th century, these are utterly innovative institutions.
But also just facts on the ground in 1945. The United States comes out of the war relatively unscathed. Its economy, its homeland had not been bombed. Europe is prostrate. The Soviet Union has been utterly devastated.
Winston Churchill, in a speech in Parliament in mid-August 1945, when the Japanese had signaled their intention to surrender, he was no longer the prime minister, but he was still in Parliament. And he gave a speech in which he said, again, it's always arrested my attention, he used an archaic version of the United States. He rendered it as a plural noun. And he said, the United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. Boy, was that ever true. I mean, that's a very simple declarative sentence that describes accurately the position this country held. You're absolutely correct in pointing out that most of the other legacy great powers had been seriously scarred and damaged by the war, not least of all the Soviet Union, again, as you correctly point out. The United States was the only major belligerent in World War II that managed to grow the civilian sector of its economy by about 15%. Most of the other major belligerents shrank the civilian sectors of their economies by about a third.
Oh, man.
So this country had really unmatched and unprecedented power and therefore capacity to reshape the international order in significant ways. And the basic blueprint or inspiration for where the Roosevelt and then the Truman administrations went was the Wilsonian dream of a measure of order and system and forums for the resolution of disputes, economic as well as political. That's all Wilsonianism.
So as we're making our way closer to present time, we don't have time to go through every presidential administration. But as far as this idea of the United States either defending democracy or defending a climate in the world where democratic nations could thrive, I want to pause in Harry Truman's 1949 inaugural address, where he talks about the United States having what you might call exclusive knowledge that it was obligated as the world's leader to share with the poor and the downtrodden. He said in his address,
the differences between communism and democracy do not concern the United States alone. People everywhere are coming to realize that what is involved is the material well-being, human dignity, and the right to believe in and worship God.
He talked about how the U.S. then had to share its science and industry with the rest of the world.
Our aim should be to help the free peoples of the world through their own efforts to produce more food, more clothing, more materials for housing, and more mechanical power to lighten their burdens.
Was that Truman's way of admitting that he understood that socialism would be attractive to much of the developing world at that point?
Yeah, and that's one of the points where I think the Wilsonian message gets, or aspiration, gets somewhat distorted, and it begins to be reinterpreted to mean that we should convert the entire world to our way of doing business and our way of governing ourselves. I repeat what I said earlier. I do not believe that was Wilson's conception of what he meant by making the world safe for democracy. So I once had a conversation with President George W. Bush when he was president, and he asked the question, with what prior presidents of the United States do you think I will be compared? And I said, well, probably Woodrow Wilson. And he said, oh, God, I hope not. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that, but he certainly didn't like the idea that he and Wilson should inhabit the same sentence or paragraph. But I do think that, again, I go back to where we started, Martin, with that famous phrase, the world must be made safe for democracy. It read in context and with care and with understanding of Wilson's mind and the kind of world he saw and could imagine, what the kind of future he could imagine. It is a long way from the mission to make other peoples democratic on the American model.
Well, I did think it would be beneficial to revisit this history because nowadays, especially if you spend any amount of time online, you can't go more than a few minutes without hearing the words fate of democracy, not just in our own country, but overseas. Joe Biden picks up on the Wilsonian theme, or maybe not, if that's not what Wilson really meant. But he uses that framing, democracy versus autocracy. Ukraine is the front line in this global struggle.
We are in the midst of a fundamental debate about the future and direction of our world. We're at an inflection point between those who argue that given all the challenges we face, from the fourth industrial revolution to the global pandemic Autocracy is the best way forward, they argue.
I like to look at the early 1990s, too, though, because there maybe was too much optimism about democracy and freedom on the march at the end of the Cold War and Fukuyama's end of history thesis. What do you think of that?
Well, the way I would put it is there was too easy an assumption made in the 1990s, and Francis Fukuyama's also widely misunderstood a phrase about the end of history.
He didn't mean history had come to an end.
Well, what I think he meant was that there was the great ideological battles of the previous century had come to a pretty definitive conclusion. But that's a little different from saying the end of history, that there will be no change forever after. That's a different matter entirely. My view of the 90s was it became too easy to assume in that decade that the democratization of government and society after society after society was somehow an organic principle of nature. It was just going to happen without any particular encouragement other than being rhetorically in favor of it. And I think that was a naive assumption about the nature of human nature itself. And we got, in fact, a lot of other regimes that came to the fore, not least of all in China and in the reconstituted Russia. And not to mention Iran, who all three of whom continue to be mischievous actors in the world stage. So here's the paradox or the conundrum or the problem with my interpretation of what Wilson meant in 1917 when he said, make the world safe for democracy. It often seems to be the case that to make the world safe for democracy, we must also promote the development of democratic regimes, because only democratic regimes can be counted on to behave themselves in the international order. So Wilson may have assumed that, if we brought enough order, enough institutional structure to the international system, even potentially rogue states would be incentivized, if not required, to behave well as international actors. We now think that's probably not tenable, and therefore the temptation continuously and repeatedly presents itself that the only way to realize the Wilsonian dream is, in fact, to transform other regimes into democratic society. There's the problem.
Wilson said, a steadfast concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. Well, about Francis Fukuyama, he gets picked on a lot, but no one is good at predicting the future. So you mentioned the inflection point of 1945 before. There was another inflection point, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and then George W. Bush's freedom agenda, which of course came about after the initial reasons for invading Iraq in 2003 fell to pieces. But in his second inaugural address, the freedom agenda, this seems to me to be a clean break from prior U.S. thinking or prior U.S. approach, or I could be overstating things. Maybe it wasn't a clean break. But anyway, the idea that instead of promoting or encouraging democracy or maybe even letting it develop at its own pace across the world, the U.S. should instead invade places like the Middle East and Afghanistan to try to nation build, turn those places into democracies.
Today, America speaks anew to the peoples of the world. All who live in tyranny and hopelessness can know the United States will not ignore your oppression or excuse your oppressors. When you stand for your liberty, we will stand with you.
I still think we're living very much in the shadow of the invasion of Iraq and the global war on terror.
I agree with that, and I think there were a lot of very poorly historically informed decisions made with respect to the war, particularly the war in Iraq. Afghanistan to a lesser extent. The idea that those ancient cultures could be more or less instantly transformed into modern democratic states, particularly by force of arms, just seems to me to be willfully ignorant of the depth of cultural values and institutions and practices and assumptions that had been baked in for centuries, if not millennia, into those cultures. Again, it's my belief that Woodrow Wilson was a good enough historian to understand that you could nurture democracy in places that already had some aspiration to be democratic and had some experience with democratic governance. But to think you could impose it on societies that had really no history of that kind of practice was just hopelessly naive.
What are the problems with framing the war in Ukraine as a front line in this global struggle?
Well, it is a front line. I think there's no question about it. It's the place where we've got kinetic war going on, not just rhetorical or ideological competition. But I was at a discussion just the other day, actually, about cybersecurity. And there was a lot of chuckling in the room when it was pointed out that many of the cyber attacks that have disrupted businesses and government agencies and so on here and elsewhere before a year or two ago originated in Ukraine. So Ukraine is not exactly, doesn't come to this conflict with clean hands, as the saying goes. It is a place with its own troubled history.
They were an aspirational democracy before the war began.
Well, yeah, and a very imperfect one.
Yes.
But my point is simply that we don't want to fall into the habit of thinking of Ukraine as this pristine, democratic, beautiful, wonderful society that was invaded by the Russians. It had its own troubled history, and we had some problems with it, as a matter of fact. But nonetheless, all that said, again, going back to Wilsonian principles once more, I think it's to the best of our ability and within the strengths in our resources and other claims in our resources, I think it's important to resist armed aggression that aims to take over territory or overthrow regimes in otherwise legitimately constituted states.
My final observation here is that when presidents, whether it's Wilson or Biden, when you elevate a struggle between, well, what is really a regional war right now, Russia versus Ukraine, based on their own unique history between the two, when you elevate such a struggle to an existential level, as Wilson said, basically the peace of the world is on the line, it then necessitates responses that will meet that challenge, meaning wars can potentially escalate to a very dangerous level. That's my final observation for you.
Well, again, Martin, very, very good observation, and it opens the door to a really complicated subject. And that is why, for more than a century, has the United States gone to war or trooped its banner of international goals under the flag of ideological competition. So I would say, to use the French phrase, Wilson did it faute de mieux. He had no real alternative. As he said in that war address on April 2nd, 1917, we seek no dominion, we seek no territory, we seek no economic gain. We're going to war in the name of principle and in the name of restructuring the whole architecture of the international system. That thread of ideological aspiration has informed so much American international behavior for more than a century. And that is one dimension of the so-called tragedy of American diplomacy, to adopt the title of an old book. We seem to quickly escalate our declared war aims because we don't have a lot of other traditional claims to assert. We haven't meaningfully been invaded since 1812. I understand about 9/11, but really has been no systematic military threat to our national existence, more than 2 centuries. We almost reflexively, going back to Wilson, clothe our international behavior in the rhetoric of high ideological aspiration, because we don't have many of the other traditional territorial resource claim sorts of interests to assert.
And you can hear that problem in a speech by Lyndon Johnson, 1967, explaining why the United States must be involved in Vietnam.
America has entered with its material power and with its moral commitment. Why? Why should 3 presidents and the elected representatives of our people have chosen to defend this Asian nation more than 10,000 miles from American shores? We cherish freedom, yes. We cherish self-determination for all people, yes. We abhor the political murder of any state by another and the bodily murder of any people by gangsters of whatever ideology. And for 27 years, since the days of Lend-Lease, we have sought to strengthen free people against domination by aggressive foreign powers.
And let's thank David M. Kennedy for his valuable insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the great Antony Beevor will join us again to discuss the Russian Revolution a century ago and the parallels to today's catastrophe in Eastern Europe. Sir Anthony has a new book out about the Russian Revolution and Civil War. The First Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, followed by a vicious civil war. What is in store for Putin as his war in Ukraine falters? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.